Um, well, welcome everyone to this Insight 2022 session on lessons for the NHS from high stakes decision making. It's an event that we're running joint between the Midlands Decision Support Network and the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College in Cambridge. I'm Fraser Batty. I work for the Strategy Unit and the Midlands Decision Support Network. I'm just going to say a few things to tee the session up, mainly focused on logistics before handing over to Julian Huppert, who's going to chair the session for us. Before I say anything on logistics, I just want to express a bit of personal delight. Delight because this is a session run in collaboration between two institutions that I count myself very fortunate to be part of and that I hold in very high regard. The first of those institutions is the Midlands Decision Support Network. We, for those of you that don't know, we are entirely focused on improving the quality of decision making in the health and care systems in the Midlands, and we do that in various different ways. We do that through big set piece bits of analytical work. We did some work on inequities in access to elective care, for example. We do it through a big education and training program, which is where I spend most of my time, where we're equipping analysts with the skills and abilities to engage with decision makers, and also doing leadership training work to equip decision makers to make better use of analysis. We run professional forums for evaluators, for evidence reviewers, that kind of thing, but all really applied and all really focused in on improving decision making. So that's one institution. The other is the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College, which is a remarkable forum directed by Julian Huppert, who I've been lucky enough to be involved in for the last couple of years. The forum's amazing. It brings together like an astonishingly diverse group of people. They have shoe designers, people who've been in charge of whole countries. Just last week, I was at a session led by an international campaigner for women's rights and a feminist barrister along with her. So brilliant, very diverse group of people, but all focused in on the big issues of the day. So really nicely focused in on some huge big topics that face our society. Both institutions, I think, the Intellectual Forum and the Decision Support Network, primarily concerned with the application of different ways of thinking about things and different ways of seeing things, and I think that's what this event is about today. In terms of logistics, just a few things to make the session run smoothly. You have to know the sessions are recorded and are shared, so I don't know what that means for your behaviour, but you now know it, and so perhaps moderate your behaviour accordingly. You should mute your microphone. If you don't, we'll mute you anyway, and perhaps turn your camera off so we can keep the focus in on the panel. It would be wonderful if you could introduce yourself in the chat box so we get a feel for who you are and where you're from, and also use the chat box, please, to raise questions for the panel and any technical issues that I will fail to deal with. The other thing is please tweet. So we have a hashtag for the Insight Festival, Insight 2022. I've also put the Intellectual Forum, the Decision Support Network and the Strategy Unit tags or accounts or whatever they're called in there too. So please tweet away. I'm going to say nothing at all about the panel. I'm just going to hand over to Julian, who's going to do that. Julian, who is the director of the Intellectual Forum, who is a fine mind, a fine man. Julian, you brought together a fine panel for us as well. So shall I just hand over to you now, and you can take us through the content of the session.
Well, thank you very much, Fraser. It's great to be with you, and as you say, it's a real pleasure to work together. So Fraser and I met a couple of years ago through Twitter. In fact, it does have some uses. Since when Fraser has been on a number of programmes in Cambridge, we've worked together for a number of activities. In fact, we had the pleasure of seeing each other at a nice dinner on Thursday night, talking to Michael Marmot, a former speaker, in fact, at the Insight conference. So thank you very much, Fraser. It's great to be here. I have a complicated background, which is basically that I don't know anything at all, but about a range of different things. So I used to be a politician. I was a member of Parliament for Cambridge. I'm mostly recovered from that. And I now work in the wonderful grounds of Jesus College in Cambridge, which you can see behind me on a slightly sunnier day. I've also dabbled quite a bit with the health sector. So when I was much younger, I was an ambulance technician with St John Ambulance, which was an interesting experience in a number of ways. And until we were abolished at the end of June, I was deputy chair of the clinical commissioning group here in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. So I got to see some of how these things worked. But I don't want to talk about me because I've got a panel of wonderful people who are actually going to talk about our subject for today. But just to say very briefly about Jesus College, because it's just possible that some of you haven't yet come to visit. We were originally set up in 1144 when a group of itinerant nuns were given a small patch of land. In 1496, the women were thrown out and replaced with an all-male college, a mistake we've since fixed, and we properly became Jesus College. And we've had some amazing people who've gone on to change the world. People like Cranmer, who wrote the Book of Common Prayer and created the Church of England. Malthus, who wrote so much about population and what we need to do about it. More recently, people like Lisa Jardine, who was a remarkable Renaissance English scholar, but also chair of the Human Fertilization Embryology Authority, combining what you might think of as two very different disciplines. And perhaps most famously, Clean Bandit, and I hope at least some of you have heard Rockabye. They've had well over 1 billion downloads. And the Intellectual Forum runs events to try to get people to think and talk. And this is a great example of that. So I'm really pleased we've managed to get a really brilliant set of people to look at this decision making, because it's one of the hardest things that we have to do in the NHS. You know, if the decisions are trivial, it's obviously easy. But I don't think the NHS is always as good as it should be at learning from outside. And so what we have is people who've had to make high stakes decisions in a lot of different environments, but also didn't want to do that old thing of just find a general, wheel them in to tell the NHS what to do. And so all 4 of our panelists not only have their high stakes, high risk experience, but also experience within healthcare in a number of different guises. And so they're actually straddling both sides of that divide. And so hopefully they can give us some more interesting and more appropriate insights. So I'm going to invite them to speak in a moment. I'll introduce them in the order they will speak. So to start off, we have Gemma Bowsher. Gemma's changed medical disciplines, but I believe is now an orthopaedic surgeon. She also has the wonderful title of being the co-lead for Health Intelligence Biosecurity in the Conflict and Health Research Group at King's College London, as well as being a senior research associate at the Intellectual Forum. So it's a great pleasure to have Gemma here again. So we're going to hear from her experience in some difficult areas in the world. We're then going to move to hear from Chris Adcock, who's a consultant in acute medicine here at Addenbrooke's Hospital, Cambridge University Hospital's Foundation Trust, but was formerly with the RAF as a medic with the rank of wing commander. I don't know who commands the other wing of the bird, but he commands at least one of them. We're then going to move to a more domestic approach and hear from Karen Dabba, who was a chief officer in the police and has done a huge range of things here, including some very, very difficult protests, for example, where you had to make decisions, but I won't try and predict all of that. She's also now a non-executive director at the Foundation Trust here, so seeing how the health sector actually works. She also is a deputy lieutenant representing now the King through Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And then lastly, we have Jonny Hynes, who's now an occupation and an aviation medicine doctor in the RAF, but he was also was a fighter pilot. So he spent 16 years in Tornadoes and Eurofighters, and he apparently does still have the helmet available just out of reach somewhere. So it's a brilliant panel. Gemma, could you start us off?
I can, Julian. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you, everyone. It's very nice to be on this panel. It's a very nice introduction, Julian. I'm thankfully actually a recovering orthopedic doctor, now a very, very baby radiologist. So yes, I do have an NHS hat, but actually most of, I think, what I will talk about in very broad terms today is the other side of my life, the kind of the side I've worked on at King's, and now thankfully the Intellectual Forum, which is very much focused on this idea of health intelligence process processes and how we think about decision making in health emergencies. And that's what much of my work based at War Studies at King's College London has focused on. And we're a really broad and diverse bunch of people. We have quite a few military people, lots of civilian humanitarian healthcare practitioners, doctors of all various stripes. And our interest is essentially to look back and to look ahead, to think about what goes into making good decisions in health emergencies. How can we train, improve, and evaluate those responses in what we sort of euphemistically refer to as complex settings? So the settings we're really interested in are conflict, settings of fragility and vulnerability, settings where there's forced migration, interesting political dynamics like illegal drugs trade, and increasingly now other issues around environment, climate change, ecological degradation. So we're interested in the complexity and thinking about how you integrate all these inputs and data sets and analytics in our kind of modern world to make better decisions. And obviously COVID-19 has been a sort of a lens to look at all of these situations through a really kind of sort of polarized political processes and other things. And we've really focused on three dynamics in terms of our interest. So one, we're really interested, and I'm sure we'll pick this up in the discussion, interested in how you manage uncertainty to make good decisions, how you match this sort of ambiguity of rapidly evolving information terrains to develop and uptake evidence. What is evidence, and who gets to say what is good evidence, what is bad evidence, and how do you filter that into the complexity of rapidly evolving bioemergencies? In this, we've taken lots of lessons from other emergencies. So, for example, we worked on a project around nuclear risks, and we were looking at the Fukushima accident, and we realized that actually one of the major issues was that some of the best evidence we were going off was the disasters in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So again, there's something here that we need to think about, is how we rapidly update the evidence we have so that when we immediately need to take up tools and approaches, you can integrate that into responses. And we luckily had the benefit of many biological emergencies with COVID, but of course we all experienced COVID-19 in various settings. I worked as a doctor during COVID, but also in other responses, and realizing that actually information was plentiful, but good intelligence was less clear. And how you manage that balance between information and intelligence, I think, is a key factor in terms of making good decisions. And I think we'll touch on that, especially with other speakers. Another interest we have is this concept of complexity. We don't live in a vacuum, and we don't live in a simple world with clear-cut lines where you get to make clear decisions with nothing else interfering, and the world is getting more and more complicated. So our group worked very closely during the pandemic on issues that were related to cybercrime. We still work heavily on issues like disinformation. We were working in settings such as northwest Syria, where there are overlaid complex emergencies, whether it's chemical weapons attacks, bombings, other outbreaks, other humanitarian and health emergencies. Making good decisions in those kinds of highly complex settings is a very different objective, but there are lessons that can be taken and I think brought back to the NHS in terms of both the development of the processes and understanding how the tools and techniques we use to develop the systems for decision making can be brought back into other settings, and can also, I think, an idea I'd like to touch on is whether or not we can think about how good processes can still result in bad outcomes, and what we can learn from those kinds of experience. I think evaluation is key. And I think finally, one area we were very focused on is understanding how in health emergencies in particular, and obviously the NHS would be a good example of this, how we have to manage competing priorities from within our silos, how we have to engage across the divide. Obviously with COVID-19, those of us in the health sector were very focused on health outcomes, right? But I think it became very much a clear topic for the general public to understand that in any decisions in these kind of difficult emergencies, you're balancing competing priorities, whether it's the economy, trade and travel, issues we've seen in health emergencies through time, such as SARS-1 was a very good example of how we can reconfigure our infrastructure around these issues that emerge during these complex emergencies. So I'm not going to dwell too much on these case studies because I do want to let the other speakers speak too, but I think I want to leave with kind of three ideas that we're very focused on. Firstly, that you can prepare to make good decisions, and you can do that by testing, training, simulating, and convening. And events like this are important to do that, but also structured events where you're red teaming, testing the vulnerabilities of organisations are key. I think it's very important also that you manage communication between decision makers and that you provide forums so that you can develop those relationships in advance. And part of that, as Fraser mentioned earlier, is that cultivation of leadership. Training leaders to work together early is critical. And finally, and this is an area I'm spending a lot of time on at the moment around early zoonotic outbreaks in the UK and globally, is thinking about knowledge transition, how you localize decision-making groups and how you build networks so that when the time comes that you need to activate them, those relationships and the networks are already existent. So I think there's a lot to discuss, but I will leave it there, Julian, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and a huge amount there. And please do put questions in the chat, which we'll come to later on. Just before I move on, though, so many interesting things there. You talked about preparing for good decisions and sort of practicing those. Have you seen the same behaviours in your medical practice here around preparing for those post-initial training, I guess, as you did out in the field?
So I think it's interesting because there are sort of, in medical practice, we're very used to simulation, and we talk about concepts such as human factors. Many of the audience would be highly familiar with that, and what you can train in so that when you come to emergency situations, you know what to do without having to think too hard. And obviously the military is very focused on concepts such as wargaming. So one of the things we've been doing at King's is thinking about how you essentially meet those two worlds together and train those processes around intelligence gathering in bioemergencies, but engaging audiences that aren't necessarily always familiar with those kinds of methods. So there's kind of a cultural element too, particularly when it comes to working with, say, humanitarian practitioners, to think about actually what works with these groups and how can you actually get everyone around the table. So I did some work with NATO during the pandemic on this, and was evaluating decision-making processes and tools. And actually, you know, there's a huge amount we can draw from NHS systems around simulation that I think is valuable. So it goes both ways. I think that's an important point. What comes back into the NHS can also go out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Gemma. We'll obviously come back to you for the conversation later. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julian, and thank you, Gemma, for sort of painting the big picture, because if a lot of what Gemma spoke about was the macro scale of critical decision making, I'm the sort of the blunter tool. I'm very much bedside orientated, albeit bedside for me has sometimes been the roadside or people's houses, or indeed sort of Afghanistan, Iraq, or the floor of an aircraft traveling at 30,000 feet back from somewhere overseas. Right now, my primary job is as a consultant in acute medicine. Adam Rooks, I lead teams through the assessment of patients presenting to hospital with acute and urgent problems, chest pain that may or may not be heart attacks, headaches that may or may not be brain hemorrhages, and so on. But my career in the Air Force involved deployed medicine, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations, aeromedical retrieval, so flying out to patients flying out to locations around the world to pick up injured or unwell soldiers, sailors, and airmen, and actually return them to the UK. And part of that then sort of pushed me into pre-hospital emergency medicine, which for most people in the UK is the air ambulances that they'll see flying out. And I spent 7 years working to establish pre-hospital emergency medicine as a subspecialty, and working in it through with MAGPAS here in the MAGPAS Air Ambulance here in the east of England. So my motivation was always how to sort of make the best decisions for the patients at that time in those circumstances. And I mean, Gemma mentioned the importance of communication, and I think at the heart of it, the ability to articulate what the objective is for yourself, but also for the people around, because healthcare is a team sport, and you will always be dealing with other people that you need to bring on. And in the most complex of situations, being able to chunk the situation down to an overarching objective and then to lead people through one step at a time, I think is absolutely important. And in the words of the House of God, the first pulse you need to take in a cardiac arrest is your own. So if you're getting stressed about this, then everyone else is too. So you need to make it more simple than that. The second point, again, they're going to come to is being able to handle uncertainty and to get comfortable with uncertainty. And the quote that I often return to is that of Colin Powell, former Secretary of State for the US, who talks about the 40-70 rule. And this is about not making decisions when you have less than 40% of the information required to make the decision, but not waiting until you have more than 70% either, because you've then lost the window of opportunity to make the decision. It's most often talked about information required, but I also think if we're dealing with uncertainty, we should talk about the confidence that we're going to make the right decision, or the confidence that the outcome that we're hoping for is going to be there. And therefore, I take a very much a more sort of flexible view of that sort of 40-70. In some cases, actually, if the consequences are less critical, actually, I can be confident with about maybe 30-60. However, if I'm dealing with a situation where an adverse outcome would be catastrophic, then actually I'm going to be wanting to look to a much greater level of certainty of the outcome. So I view with that. And that sort of brings me on to a couple other concepts. The ability to sort of know what the window of opportunity is. When is that going to shut? That was very key when we were looking at aeromedical retrieval. And actually we were having to move to flight lines to get people onto flights to position overseas. We'd have to sort of work to that. Pragmatic pessimism is another concept that I sort of bring into this, and that's the ability to not just gamble or put all our chips on the fact that this is going to go to plan, but actually to sort of have an idea to say, well, actually, what does failure look like here? And actually, if we do find ourselves going sideways, actually, what would we do at that situation? Do I have the ability to manage that situation? That's key in pre-hospital emergency medicine if we're talking about airway management, where we're putting someone to sleep to intubate their airway so that we can then ventilate. Have to think about what the possibility that we may not be successful in that. And therefore, if that's the case, how are we going to manage that situation there? And we'll talk about a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, a plan D. Final thing of those things is actually risk holding, and actually sort of being aware of actually who holds the risk of this. And that's different to understanding who's going to have the consequence of this, because largely that's the patient in front of us that is going to have the sort of the health outcome. But in terms of holding the risk, I see that most often when I'm on call dealing with a shift that has been subject to staff vacancies because of short-term illness and otherwise. And junior doctors are concerned with the Bauer fallout of the consequences of making decisions in the best intention in an unsafe situation. And so in those situations, I think it's very important that as consultants or executives, on-call directors, that actually we're very clear that who is holding the risk of that situation. I think that's something the military do very, very well. It'd be interesting to hear from Karen whether that's true for the police force. But I think for the NHS, it's phrases that just aren't really, it's language and that really isn't understood. And then I won't repeat the side of things about preparing and training for it through simulation, visualization, and debrief to identify lessons and to learn from them. But I think it's also important to have personal reflection on the actual impact that these decisions have on ourselves, so that we can recognize the toll that difficult decisions do make, and that we can actually sort of make sure we can build into that opportunities for healing and recovery to pull us back to a position where we can go through it all over again.
Well, thank you very much for that, Chris, and for giving that sort of picture of what it looks like, and some really interesting phrases there about the pragmatic pessimism. And I thought I'd heard all Colin Powell's quotes, but I hadn't heard the 40-70 rule, so I'll now have to think a bit more about it. Can I ask about, because I think risk is a theme which might well come up, and I think we'll hear from the next two speakers a bit more, I think, about some of that. What about failure? So one of the things that surprised me when I came into the CCG was how toxic a failure was seen at a systematic level, and which seemed strange, because if you don't try new things, sometimes you will never succeed. is that connected just with risk, or do you think there's a particular aversion to something going wrong?
I think I'm going to take a guess that when you talk about failure, that's failure of transformational change or of a change initiative. Yes, I think that's partly due to the sort of the tensions in the health service, that everyone's running at full pelt all the time, and that I don't think people have the sort of the energy a lot of the time to embrace doing things differently. I think they'd actually prefer to be Winnie the Pooh coming down the stairs behind Christopher Robin, hitting the head on each step rather than considering there's an alternative. I always take the view of just trying to fail better. I think that I think we set too big a target. We want to transform things, whereas actually in reality, what we want to do is just make it 2 to 5% better every turn of the cycle.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. Karen, over to you for a non-military, hopefully non-global security perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. And what's been interesting just listening to the two speakers is the similarities that are starting to emerge. So my background's policing, albeit, as you said, I'm non-exec director with the Cambridgeshire People Foundation Trust. But within policing, as far back as probably 2012, 2013, we had a decision-making model that we use in policing for making decisions. And that model is applicable both to police officers and police staff. And it very much is a model that can be used for both spontaneous, fast-moving, dynamic incidents, as well as planned operations, or even planned staff issues that we've just heard mentioned. You know, we went through in 2010 some significant cuts within policing, and very much this decision-making model was applied then as it is today. What I want to talk about is that high-stakes firearms decision-making model, because that's probably the one that would illustrate it best. So as you can see from the slide, if you could put the slide up for me, please. So at the heart of the national decision-making model within policing is the Code of Ethics. This was developed in 2013-14. I led the programme board to develop this, and fundamentally at the heart of all decision-making within policing is the Code of Ethics. And the principles there around what we would see as principles of public life, of accountability, fairness, integrity, leadership, objectivity, openness, just to mention a few. So that's at the heart of the Code of Ethics. And it basically draws upon the standards of behaviour you would expect from police and police staff. So I will act with honesty, integrity, authority, respect, and courtesy, the use of force, which is very applicable in this scenario. I will follow orders. I will do my duties responsibly with it and diligently, respect confidentiality, be fit for work, and conduct myself in a manner that would be expected of a serving police officer or police staff. And last but not least is to challenge inappropriate behaviour. So at the heart of our decision making with policing are those principles and standards of behaviour that you'd expect from a serving police officer and a member of staff. So as you look at the model there, as I'm going around that model, and I'm going to use this scenario of a dynamic firearms operation where if callers come in, and as a firearms commander, I will be told the information that is available at the time. And as I'm going around that model, I will continually reflect and consider, am I being consistent with the Code of Ethics? Am I doing what would be expected of me by the victim, the people involved in the operation, the community? And is it what the police service would expect of me in this situation? And is this action or decision likely to reflect positively on my professional and policing in general? And can I go on to explain my actions? So as you can see there, the first thing you would be doing is gathering the information and intelligence. And we've already heard about ambiguity and uncertainty. At the end of the day, with a dynamic firearms operation or public order operation, you've just got to go with the information you've got at the time. What's happening? What do I know so far? What don't I know? And then I have to assess that and look at the threat and the risk that's developing and come up with a working strategy. And that threat and risk will be both to the public, it will be to police officers, it will be to perpetrators and victims. And as you can imagine, this is a dynamic information, but you've got to get around that circle and start taking action. So it is about what is the information I know at the time, what does that information tell me in terms of the risk, and develop a working strategy. As I move around the circle, it's about considering what are the powers I have, what's the legislation that will back me up, what are the policies within the organisation. And in this scenario, it'll be, do I have the power to deploy a firearms team, yes or no? Can I arm them up, yes or no, and send them in? So that will be the next thing to consider, is the powers and policies. And then I've got to identify, what are my options? Is it an immediate threat? Are there limits of the information I have at hand that are going to sort of blindside me? How much time do I have available? Are we talking 5 minutes? Are we talking 30 minutes? Are we talking an hour to deploy that that firearms team? Because fundamental to all of this is about protecting the public and preventing crime. And then it's looking at your own knowledge and experience, the knowledge of experience of the teams you've got around you, and the impact of any potential action on that situation that the public would want me to take, and do things that happen as anticipated. So you'll take those things into consideration, and then you've got to take action. It's as simple as that. As simple as that. You've got to take action, and it's in 2 steps. Take action, review it. What's happening now? And you continually then go round that cycle. If time is on your side and you've got 10 minutes, or you've got 5 minutes, or you've got 30 minutes, because the armed response team is leaving Huntingdon and heading all the way up to Peterborough, all good and well. But I've been in situations where it's happening now, and you've got to make those decisions sort of fast and furious. And with all decision making, it's about recording your decisions. Were they proportionate? Were they legitimate? Were they necessary? And were they ethical? And were they considered reasonable in the circumstances? And did I communicate those decisions effectively? And were the decisions and the rationale for them recorded appropriately? Because within all things in policing, the chances are you're going to end up in front of a judge, or if not a barrister, question you about what you did and why you did it and how you did it. And those decisions are then monitored, reassessed, and were they necessary? And as I think has already been previously mentioned here, it is about what lessons have we learned from the decisions and the outcomes in the context of this scenario firearms operation. But as I mentioned earlier, this decision-making model I use now, even as a non-exec within the trust, because it's a principle that I find works for me and make sure that I'm not missing some important elements of the decision making when it comes to performing my role as a non-exec. And I will stop there, and hopefully that should be about 5 minutes.
Very, very, very much on. Yes, thank you. It's very, and I think there's, a lot of really interesting things there. But one thing that strikes me is that comment that you made about how anytime you're doing something, there's a good chance you'll be in front of a judge or a barrister about it. Because there is that sense, we remember things like the Duggan shootings. We remember, fortunately, we have a very small number of them, but they do remember. And I wonder if there's a distinction between the fact that everybody here has had to make very quick decisions, but many of them wouldn't be in a position where they know they would have to defend it in that much depth. Maybe that's not right. But I think there is an interesting dynamic there. Can I also just say, because you say you use this tool as a non-exec, which implies that others perhaps have a different way of thinking about it. What's most surprised you about NHS decision making as you've come into it?
I think it is very much linked to what Chris said about failing and getting things wrong. I think as a police officer, you've got to do something. And it will invariably go wrong. I've dealt with a firearms incident. The guy has then gone on to commit suicide up in his attic, and while the firearms team is there. So I think it's that confidence to make a decision, knowing it may go wrong and there are lives at stake. And having this structure with the principles of the code of ethics within it provides a level of I don't know, a foundation and a confidence to go on and make those decisions and not be fearful of getting it wrong, because yeah, it could well go wrong. But again, you've followed the model, you can justify all your thinking, you've assessed the risk, you've looked at your powers policies and your legislation, you've done something, because there's not an option to not do something. And, you know, at the risk of being controversial, when you look at all what happened up in Manchester with the bombing, it is about something's happened, I need to make a decision, and my fundamental role in life is to protect life and prevent crime. So in those circumstances, I've got to go forward. And I think it's having that confidence within the NHS to just, and it's a flippant phrase, but just to crack on and do something.
Yeah, so there can be that sense of sort of paralysis for fear, which we might come back to. And there's a number of things coming up in the chat. And just a reminder, after our final panelist, we may have a little bit more conversation, but then we would love to have questions from the public. And so with that, Jonny, thank you for being with us. What's your perspective then?
So thanks very much, Julian. I think the great thing the panel have done so far is introduce my topics that I was going to talk about without me speaking. So I'm going to really talk to you about flying fast, pointy things, but also try and make it relevant to, well, hopefully high stakes decision making. So that's my plan. I'm conscious that sometimes, and some of the things I say may not have direct NHS translation, but I will try my best to perhaps give you the angle where I think it could squeeze in. So my three topics are creating a safe culture, and in good old military terms, teams and leadership. So talking about creating a safe culture, I think and wonder if we are able to debrief regularly within the NHS, and whether we could perhaps emphasise more opportunity to debrief regularly. I wondered if we could focus a lot on the can we do better bits rather than look at what we did well. And I wonder how much and how much opportunity we have for mission rehearsal and practicing things that may or may not go wrong. And really the attention needs to be, for me, from a flying background, in what could go wrong. If you're going into the workplace and not thinking, when you've had your first cup of tea in the morning, right, what could really ruin my day today, then you're perhaps thinking of the wrong things if you come at it from a flying perspective. Because from my perspective, we've got a simulator, a lovely tool that I jump in, perhaps, or used to jump in 12 to 18 times a month. And that will test my ability to handle the big things that will ruin my day, but also handle the things that I will see regularly. And I wonder how much in the NHS, doctors at all levels get to really practice that. How much will ruin my day and how much do I see regularly? I ask the question because I don't know. I think the other thing to say as well is perhaps think about skill failure. I know to release a weapon in Typhoon without getting it too heavily into the technical stuff, there's a hands-on throttle and stick. There's about 18 different switch positions you can use, and some of those maneuvers are all automatic to either release a weapon or drop a bomb. And that requires motor skills that become natural over time, but those skills fade. And so we're aware in our business, or in my old business, that actually if Joe Bloggs has been off and had 2 weeks in there, wherever he has been catching some rays, we won't throw him back into a complicated air combat scenario and expect him to be releasing weapons and using those motor skills straight away. Do we do that with surgeons? I don't know. And do we think about perhaps the skill fade elements that, returning somebody who's had some time off, circa Bowsher, for argument's sake, are we thinking about the scenarios that we're asking, that we're placing our people into, and thinking of, cleverly about what are the risks we're putting them in? So that's the bit about creating a safe culture, which leads nicely for me onto teams. I think, again, very briefly on teams, can we get rota writers to create a team where possible? Because I remember I've been fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, to be a houseman in two eras. I was a houseman in the late 90s, where I used to go in on a Thursday, come out on a Tuesday, never saw the light of day, and sister used to really try her best to get me some sleep where possible. Whereas I did my house jobs again in 2011, and it became noticeable that with the shift system, it's very much to them and us, and nobody really knew anybody. And there's quite a lot on, well, some nurse-doctor friction in certain areas, which makes, the whole purpose of a team is knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses. But if you can't work together as a team, you can't really back each other up that side. So is it possible to build teams again in this new shift system culture? I think also individually, you need to know where you go when you get stressed. And it's part of the simulation thing for me. What kind of foolish things do I start doing when I really get maxed out and stressed? And knowing you individually, where you go to in that place. And again, perhaps a team member, if they knew you well, would know where you go to and help support that. So that's the teams piece. I'm sorry, there's no military talker ever going to ever say anything without talking about leadership. So I'm sorry, it's my third one. It's such a big thing. I think it can be taught. There's no doubt in my mind it can. I still think, unfortunately, there are people who don't want to do it in all aspects of big organizations, and that can really lead to disastrous results, as we know. I think you can start leadership training early as a junior doctor and then massage it as you go through. And I think also, stating the obvious, part of being a good leader is also being a good follower and knowing when it's not your turn to be the chapel lady at the top. And the final part about leadership, leading into my 4 minutes, 50 seconds, is good leaders create a safe and just culture, which is back to number one. Thanks for your time, Julian. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So, some really interesting things. And I'm also struck by the lessons that have come in from the checklist manifesto, for example, and some of these other procedures and how you can learn. Whereas, you know, I'm told it's not true anymore, that the approach is much more see one, do one, teach one. You know, I think they've got rid of the C1 phase now, haven't they? But there really are some interesting things there about how you prepare for things. And I think there is that really interesting piece there about how hot swappable people are. You know, is one surgeon the same as another surgeon? Is one nurse the same as another nurse? As long as you have, you know, 7 at this level, that's basically the same. And I think there's a really interesting dynamic there. Can I also just ask, because you also talked about sort of the mission rehearsal pieces and trying to make sure you go through all of that. To what extent does that happen with more complex medical interventions? You know, I understand there are, for more complex medical interventions, the equivalent of a mission rehearsal. And is it just that other things are seen as too simple to repeat so often?
I should probably let my colleagues or Chris answer that one. Certainly, I've seen surgical training tools that I've used, you know, mission rehearsal, and this goes wrong, that goes wrong, and a hot, you know, if you like, a red team debrief on it. But, you know, not seen those for a while, but certainly in medical terms, I'm going to hand Chris that sandwich and see what he thinks.
Yeah, thanks, Jonny. I mean, I think Gemma's probably more with the orthopedics and I think surgical interventions. I mean, but no, we have. I mean, I direct on advanced life support courses where we teach or support the learning of resuscitation skills for the patient who's just suffered a cardiac arrest, and that's a sort of it's a 4-year qualification. So once the doctors and nurses doing it get their qualification, it's then they're off into the world. And my closing speech for every course is to sort of encourage them to not let a week go by before they go back to their units and they actually go and look at the resus trolleys, that they sit down and they actually sort of pass on some of this knowledge. They sort of the see one, do one, teach one. I think it gets a bit of a bad rap, but actually one of the most effective ways to actually sort of internalizing knowledge is to then try and sort of turn it into your own words and teach it on. But I think, again, it comes back to the fact that the NHS is running at 105% all the time, that it's when everything is given to fighting fires, there is very little time to rehearsal. And I think that's the big shame, because actually I think if we were able to give us that space, I think people would feel more comfortable, that just culture would evolve much more naturally, that I think managers will be able to manage rather than fight fires. And I think the actual clinicians and practitioners, whether that's nurse, healthcare assistant, doctor, surgeon, would have the time to really work on refining their techniques and their skills.
Thank you, Jonny, for passing the question to Chris, and then who then clearly tried to slightly pass it to Gemma, and I assume if it could have rolled around. So in a moment, I'm going to take questions that have come up in the chat. But can I just ask almost the flip side? Because it strikes me that in policing, we have Peelian principles. And one of them is that the aim of the police isn't to arrest as many people as possible. It's to prevent crime in the first place. But it doesn't seem that there's quite such a drive in some aspects of the health system at the moment to say, actually, success is that we didn't do anything. Whereas I suspect in some of your other things, you know, it's Chris, it's presumably better if you don't have to go and rescue somebody and bring them back. If you don't have a crisis in a conflict zone, if there's a way of avoiding that from happening, and presumably if you don't have to do a risky maneuver in a plane, that's helpful. Is there a space for thinking about how we don't just get excited by the high risk of doing something, but find ways to avoid the need to do things? Anybody can answer who feels moved to comment.
I'll dive in very, very quickly. I mean, I think it's one of the sadnesses, particularly for people working in public health, is that they often get very little glory, because it's a bit like housework, right? Good public health is invisible, because it's the really sort of intense focus on sanitation, hygiene, vaccination, all the stuff that is preventative. So when it works, we don't see it. And so part of the problem is we don't see it, so we don't celebrate it. So it's really, it's easy to celebrate the heroic surgeon who's cracking a chest and doing this and that, even if it's a catastrophic, failure, if the process was good. But we don't celebrate, the many, many successes that occur on a daily basis in the NHS, which is, not having terrible epidemics of vaccine preventable diseases all the time. That's a tremendous success, but we don't talk about that in such a way. Chris and others will be familiar with, the DATIC system, the sort of incident reporting system, and there are sort of attempts to create, there's the GREATICS, the celebration of good practice, and in many ways that's a good thing, but we are less good, and part of that is this time and pressure and the lack of space for us to actually sit down and take a breather to celebrate these successes, both at the very small level and at the very big level in the NHS.
Can I come in there, Julian? Because I would say the prevention crime is the non-glamorous stuff of policing, and it is, as Gemma's just said, in the health service, you're busy chasing the criminals, you're busy trying to detect the crime, and you really haven't got time to look up and think, okay, how can we prevent some of this stuff? And it's the glory, isn't it? It's the glory is the big jobs and the big squad jobs. That's where all the glory is, the big firearms jobs. But similarly, yes, you haven't got time to focus on the prevention. So it's not too dissimilar.
Chris, Jonny?
I just wonder, again, I'm fortunate in that when I was flying, I had time to train, but I just wonder whether there's an acknowledgement within the NHS or such like that, by not providing an element of time for people to train, they're actually letting their teams and sides down, but not just that, just introducing risk. Because to me, it's a key element of avoiding error is to practice what you're going to do on a daily basis. And if you just rely on a set of NYCP exams ago, well, he did his exams 3 years ago, that'll be fine. I think you're really throwing people in on the fire and introducing risk.
I mean, I was going to reflect on the sort of what's often a definition of wisdom, isn't it? That they say that anyone can operate. A good surgeon knows when to operate, and a great surgeon knows when not to. We can see this in all aspects of performance, whether it's the sort of the musician who knows when not to play, or I think sort of in martial arts, it's that the best way to sort of to not lose a fight is not to start one in the first place, and I guess that's partly these things. That a lot of the things that motivate us to anything in life is the wanting to do stuff, and that's natural. And I think to try and temper that in someone, I wouldn't be able to stop my 8-year-old doing stuff because that's what he wants to do. But I think therefore it's actually sort of then recognizing the reality of that, so that as those of us at more senior positions can maybe then sort of temper that and sort of put those measures in place to try and do that, like emphasize public health as Gemma says, but also to give those roles for people to move more into health promotion or prevent in the police.
So there's a number of questions that have come in privately to me and publicly, and I'll try to get through a few of those. And again, to the panel, you're all very welcome to comment, but don't feel you all have to speak on everything unless you want to. But can I start off with a question from Zoe Turner, who was interested in, I think, Karen's stuff about the ethical dimension of decision making. And do any of the panel have experience of debriefing for ethics outside the legal implications? Anybody had an ethical debrief, I guess, or an unethical debrief?
No, it was. I mean, it was certainly a massive part of deployment, of pre-deployment training from a medical perspective before going overseas. In that, we'd have to talk about the sort of the reality of the situation, because certainly in Afghanistan we would be treating at any one time, we would be treating UK, US service personnel who are injured. We could be treating members of the Afghan security forces, and we could be treating local Afghans, civilians who were caught up in this. We might be treating sort of combatants who were then referred to as captured personnel. And actually, although we had the resources to deliver healthcare to the maximum level we needed to, there was a sort of an ethical question about whether it was actually appropriate to do that in all cases. And the example being that actually sort of saving a triple amputation, so a person who's sustained a triple amputation from a UK or US background, where they're going to go back to a sort of a resource healthcare setting and have prostheses and the support and rehabilitation is a very different experience to if this was a local civilian. And therefore we had deployed medical directors that were clinicians but were separated from decision making, or separated from clinical care, so they could support the decision makers of the clinicians in those cases. And we talk about it for a week beforehand when we'd sort of go on pre-deployment training, where we'd rehearse as a hospital, again taking time out to rehearse and drill. We would we'd simulate a 3-day in the life of the hospital in Camp Bastion with cases that were drawn down from real life experiences, from sort of from mass casualty events to epidemics of diarrhea, vomiting. It was all there.
Anyone else want to pick up on ethical debrief? Stunned silence. I mean, I think it is a really interesting question to reflect afterwards about how that might have worked, and whether there is the space for those discussions. I think it goes back to the comments that a few people have made about the constant pressure the NHS is under, that there doesn't feel like there is that sort of, now here's a day where we can just draw a breath and work out what's happening. You know, it's winter pressures all year round, and there's never that moment. So,
and I mean, the other question I was trying to think, look back to the question in the chat, but the other point I have with that as well, which comes to Karen's position of the firearms, is I think it's also important that when we do sort of analyse cases, we analyse it against the impact of having done nothing, as opposed to, you know, we start off actually, well, what is our baseline position here if we did nothing? What would have been happened there? And therefore, what are the ethics of the intervention, both in terms of outcome and what the consequences of that are, as opposed to what is often set as we're measured against gold standard outcomes for different situations entirely. And I think that's often missing. I think when these cases are looked at, that critical decisions made at 4 o'clock in the morning by a junior doctor are analysed and judged by consultants who are looking at the case with a cup of coffee at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
And what you have just prompted in my mind is, and it's before we had the national decision-making model, I worked in child protection. So it's always that dilemma, do you take the child, don't you take the child, out of the context of home? Now, you've got your legal framework and you've got your threat, risk and harm to the child, but there's always that dilemma, where would the child be best placed at that moment in time, in a week's time, in a month's time, you know, in a year's time. So in that context, whether it's ethical decision making or ethical dilemmas, I don't know, but they're probably the harder ones to make. You know, in the here and now, yes, that child's got to come out of the home, but in the slower time and as we move forward, that's the difficult. Do you send them back? Do you not send them back? And they were very hard decisions to make.
A couple of the questions that have come in are actually from Fraser, who's very politely typing them to me rather than just barging in. And so can I perhaps start off with one of those, but please do keep putting questions in. So Karen mentioned the idea of a common framework for decision making, where everybody's using the same sorts of tools. Do the panel think there's a case for using something like that in the NHS?
Happy to jump in. Do I think there's a case? I think there is a case for familiarising teams and clinical networks with those tools and making available those tools and demonstrating cases to show how valuable they can be in a range of settings, healthcare and non-healthcare settings. I think there's always this balance between maximizing the benefits of these attempts at standardization, whether it's in decision making or intelligence gathering or anything like that, but also amplifying the benefits of the individual attributes of, whether it's the specific decision makers or the team itself or the local environment, and tailoring those two. That's the space for chemistry where really the best decisions can make. Anyone can follow and be trained to follow a kind of clear and command and control structure, and that works probably a certain majority percentage of the time. But once we start getting into these really complex scenarios, that's where the benefits of leadership comes in, and that's where we have to understand these kind of complex cultural situations. And the NHS is not always the best at building those really adaptive processes and tools. That's kind of one of the areas we've been quite interested in, is thinking about how you do that in conflict settings, right, where there's just crisis upon crisis upon crisis and never a moment to breathe. The NHS is kind of a version of that in its own way. So yes, I think there's always space to give people these kinds of rigid tools, but we also have to liberate people to play around with them in the best possible way.
Anyone else want to be? So Karen, I mean, how rigid is the tool? Is it ever a problem having a structured tool like that?
No, I never found it so, because it's not necessarily rigid, because at the time, some of the situations you're moving so fast, you probably might forget a bit, but it's almost intuitive and instinctive that's the sort of process you go round. I think with the code of ethics, just picking up on Gemma's point, when you look at the elements of the code of ethics around the principles and what you or your team as a collective have to do around openness, transparency, I think that's where some of the flexibility and the nuances come into it. I suppose when you're running a firearms operation, you want something pretty rigid. Simple as that, because I think going to be checked against. But I suppose looking at, we did some massive cuts in areas of the business within in the force, and it is okay, do I put my resources in child protection? Do I put them in ops? Do I put them over in investigating burglaries? That's where you've got to look at the context, the wider context of the community, what the community want, and that's where, as Gemma said, the leadership comes in about that decision-making model, notwithstanding you've got that kind of structure, because ultimately it is leadership, it's the public looking in, it's the public accountability that you're really answering to, and keeping people safe. Where do you want to put your resources is where the highest risk is. So yeah, I think it's pliable, I think is the word I'd like to use.
Chris, Jonny? No. So then just pick up, because both of you mentioned leadership as quite a big theme there. What specific approaches do you think NHS leaders ought to be adopting to try to improve decision making? What is it that is needed from all of those sort of big leaders?
I go with, and you top me off, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, so I think it's possibly easier for me to say working with NHS. And I think it's one of the things that Nadine said in the chat. I think a big thing that frontline healthcare workers in the NHS would benefit from is a clear statement about risk holding. And I think there is. My office is in the emergency department. I work through there every day, and whether it's the nurses, the healthcare assistants, the emergency medicine doctors, they are absolutely on the front line, juggling with the crowding. And I think it would be appropriate and for leadership to actually sort of hold the risk explicitly. And there's different ways of doing that, and it's not also an opportunity to say thank you. And there's a danger that words repeated too often then lose their impact. But actually, I think sort of messages at the start of a shift, just to say we understand the critical situation, we've done everything we can to, and actually it's now a question of doing the best you can within that circumstances, and we hold the risk for the situation going in. And then likewise at the end of that, of actually saying a thank you for sort of having put up with that. To that extent, Adam Rooks did. They put together their CUH awards last year, or earlier this year, which was an opportunity to reward individuals and teams and initiatives across the trust, to say thank you and to point out for that. And I think it's always important that we, as well as looking down kindly on the frontline workers, also that there has to be that sort of togetherness of this, that we are ultimately in the same place, and an understanding of the challenges to management and leadership in that regard.
So somewhat controversial comment at the moment with a couple of headlines, but Jonny, were you going to?
The only thing I'd say is just go back to my point about leadership and teams. I think it's really challenging when you're trying to lead a disparate group of people who turn up on a different every day. And to try and answer your former question, can rota writers be smarter to try and get the same core team together on the shop floor for a week, maybe, so that Chris is their leader, whatever, and I see Chris is smirking. I wonder whether it's possible to do that, because it's difficult to lead and follow when you're in a totally unfamiliar environment and you don't know everybody, because you don't know the strengths and weaknesses and who to turn to for an answer. And I guess that fits in with who owns the risk, but it'd be still nice to know, that someone's got my back as well.
No, I was smirking because that I'm going to talk about sort of artificial intelligence and other sort of decision-making tools that I know that Julian's sort of heavily interested in and invested in that. I think rota writing is one of those areas which we need to take the human element out of it. I think there is absolutely the ability that we could release we could release human time to care by taking away rota writing from clinicians or medical staffing, and actually give it to a program or an algorithm that could actually build in not just safe rota patterns for meeting the contract, but actually could start to look at machine learning in a way that actually we could start to put these teams together. And if that was true there, it could look at sort of, it could link in with attendances. There would be I think a massive step forward and would release energy and time.
Julian, just picking up on your question about leadership, I think, and I can only talk from my experience as a non-exec and within my trust, there's something about an honesty and an openness I think would help. We know it's bad. We know it's probably not going to get better anytime soon. So as a non-exec, when you ask the questions and you get what you sense is a good answer, you sometimes think, could you just say, it's bad, it's terrible, we can't do this, we can't do that? Because in terms of those on the front line, they're hearing a narrative from the top that's saying, oh yes, we can do this, we can do that, we've sorted this, we've sorted that, where they're thinking, not from where I'm standing. So there's almost a compassion to just be honest and say, it's bad, it's probably not going to get any better anytime soon, do your best. As just been said there, fail better, because mistakes will be made, failures will be made, and people will die. But it's that compassionate understanding to show as a leader, so your people on the ground realise you understand where they're coming from, I think.
There's a really interesting piece there, because one of the things that shocked me when I started doing things in NHS was that sense of fear of admitting that things weren't working. And I don't know if others have seen that in other places, which is unhelpful, because as you say, it's much better to say we can't do this if you can't, than to feel too scared to admit it and carry on until it all falls apart catastrophically.
Absolutely. And we've just, the report that just came out from the maternity unit where they talked about looking good while doing bad, is happening. So it's almost like, don't pretend all is rosy if it's not, because it's almost disingenuous for people on the front line who know it sure as hell isn't. So yeah.
Gemma, do you want to pick up on either the fear factor or the leadership decision-making?
Well, I think a bit of both, really. I mean, I was just, the various comments reminded me of an interaction I had. It took 5 years into my medical career for a consultant to turn around to me and say, just so you know, in case you didn't realise, you will make decisions that are likely to harm people. This is after 5 years of working through a pandemic, and actually to have that voice very clearly for the first time, to be essentially told, it's okay, it's not okay, but you have to appreciate that the decisions you make are obviously high consequence, and so the price of them, also the price of failing, goes up, and you will do that. That's okay. There is a process for it. I think it's you're right. This idea that we need to be less disingenuous in a way, and honest about the fact that we work in this high stake environment, that the decisions are important, and of course they're not always going to hit the mark. I think it's interesting that well, 3 out of 4 of us, I started actually life not in healthcare, but in aviation security. And the kind of the culture, it's a bit of a cliche in healthcare at the moment, if we could learn more from aviation, and I have my own views on that. But there are benefits to that mindset too. And I think that sort of openness around error, failure, and the need to train failure better is really important. But again, sometimes the NHS can really cling on to that kind of message, and it can become a bit of a zero-sum kind of narrative. But I think there are really important lessons there. And actually, honesty is really the first step in all of it.
I was interviewing for a senior position at the CCG, I won't say which one. And one of the questions that we asked, I can't know if it was me or one of my colleagues who was actually asking the question of candidates, was, it's been a complex time during the pandemic. Can you tell us about a mistake that you made with hindsight and what you learned from it? And what struck me in particular was one candidate who basically said they hadn't made any mistakes, which struck me as either astonishing because they're brilliant and we were stupid not to hire them, or alarming. And perhaps unfairly, maybe they were the best person ever. And there does seem to be a bit of a lack of culture. Are there sort of any mistakes that you've made that you'd feel comfortable sharing and that you learnt from as a result?
I'll start, because yes, several probably, certainly in flying on a daily basis. But the culture thing that we were talking about was pretty much every day you debriefed, and the culture was, you don't talk about the things that went well, you talk about the things that you could do better. And the surefire thing that will get you, I wouldn't exaggerate, but binned off the squadron would be to not admit to a flight safety incident. So to not put your hand up and go, this is what I did, this was bad. And that's indoctrinated in you from day one. So that culture just goes with you. But it's not like you put your hand up, oh, you evil person, don't do that again. It's very much, okay, what happened? You're a human. How can we train it so that it doesn't happen again? And again, I don't want to throw spears at the NHS, but I wonder how many people are still fearful of failure and error, i.e. to be human. And that can really sometimes affect the way you work.
No, I think it is the complete opposite way around. I think I think everything about it is about trying to sort of avoid the mistakes, to distance ourselves from them. And so the interesting thing about the person you interviewed is that they've probably been conditioned to forget their mistakes. And actually the truth is they can't forget those mistakes. And that's the biggest error of all, isn't it? Because if you don't remember your mistakes or look at them, then you can't learn from them. I think you can look at massive mistakes and little mistakes. I mean, there was the mistakes not to sort of recognise the consequences that healthcare was having on me when I was doing the pre-hospital emergency medicine and neurocritical care. That cost relationships at the time. It cost me sleep. There've been other mistakes where I have I've made errors in communication with teams, and that has had an impact on an individual, or has had an impact on several individuals, and their sense of wanting to work. And I've made decisions clinically which have been then sort of retrospectively sort of wrong, or where I've sort of excluded conditions, or I've not appreciated the severity of illness, and that then becomes apparent. And when I did have my first error that was then sort of declared as a serious incident, I was visited over the next, it was on a Monday of the start of a 7-day shift. And on the Tuesday, it became apparent. And as it was then declared on the Wednesday, and having to sort of then still only be halfway through the week with the same team that we're working through, I was then visited by several senior members of the consultant team that I worked with, who all shared me their first story of their big mistake. And I think what is remarkable there is that was shared in private. And whilst it was of great comfort then, it's perhaps not it's not really paying it forward in terms of the service we could do to sort of doctors and nurses coming up now.
Just jumping in, actually, it occurs to me, Chris, I think, and actually it pulls on something that Karen said as well. I think maybe we need to stop seeing all of these successes and failures as super binary options, right? In good decision-making processes and in ways that could be aided by decision-making frameworks, there's opportunity for review, right? And evaluation, changing course, and having permission to do that's also really important. And actually, maybe what might be really valuable is having an error conference, right? Or when junior doctors start having, you get all your other mandatory training, but actually having a session where you hear about those difficult errors that people have made and what they've done and how they've improved and how they've kind of recovered from that. I think there was lots of people have read Adam Kay's books, but and lots of doctors have. I think some of the stories that have resonated with doctors more than anyone else are the ones about the mistakes he made, because those are the ones that aren't necessarily put in an open place. I think they may have horrified the general public more, but actually that's those having space to discuss those kinds of failures in an open space is important. And obviously, as Chris, you touched on, the Bowsher case has obviously constrained some of those opportunities, and we in our group, when we work in other medical cultures, it's striking how the kind of the fear of failure isn't as keen in other places, where that sense of need to get on with it, as Karen mentioned, is perhaps higher. And so I think maybe we need to reflect on what is intrinsic to the way we do stuff in the NHS that has cultivated that particular culture. Think about how we can break that down a bit more. But I think it comes from within the profession as well. There's a role for consultants and juniors, and I think we probably need to, maybe this is my controversial thing, move beyond just the DATIC system as the kind of sole repository of error and incident reporting.
Karen.
Yeah, just coming on to the errors, probably made many, can't have been too bad because I'm here and not locked up. But I think just picking up on a point there around when just thinking back now about mistakes I've made, it's probably been around communication and relationships. And I can think of one individual in particular, very, very fractious relationship within my immediate line manager. And it reached the point of, well, it's either you or me who's going here, and it's not going to be me, which was very unhelpful. And I'm sitting here thinking about that relationship and then looking at the decision-making model, because I didn't use the model at the time. It was very much an emotionally driven decision-making. I'm not going to talk them to we're going to have an argument, whatever it might be. It probably would have eased that whole relationship to have made some decisions about dynamics of that relationship much better than they were. So I think most of my errors over the years of my career has been around fractious relationships and my approach to them. And the code of ethics and everything would have seriously helped me.
And I think that there's a comment from Ezra just coming about how to move on after errors and mistakes and how to avoid that fear. And I think just do chip in if you want to. To me, part of it is about knowing that you're in a safe space where reasonable errors will be tolerated and there will be help to fix them. And I think, to me, there's always a difference between a obviously culpably stupid error and the errors that people are always going to make. And you need to respond to them very, very differently. And I think we would get rid of some of the fear if it was known that it was, you know, it's not good to have made a mistake. You try not to, but it's going to happen and we just need to live with it. I mean, I certainly reflect on some of my errors. There have been many and lots of errors, but, you know, in the NHS context, you know, my biggest error was that there was a particular issue that ran on for 4 or 5 months, and several of the senior people on the CCG, we've talked about it since, I don't quite know how we did it, just failed to talk to each other. We thought that we were the only ones who thought there was a thing and that everyone else was okay and it was fine. And somehow we just failed. And I've certainly learned some lessons about how to do that, that I would now be more proactive about trying to say, look, I am really concerned about this. Can I actually check, rather than assuming you're all fine? And I think we could have made some much better decision on a lot of things if we'd fixed that. We're beginning to run slightly out of time, so I wanted to give one last chance for everybody on the panel to just sort of share any final reflections about anything that we've talked about. And I'm not going to try and summarize everything that we've said because there's just too much. But you know, we you know, is there more to say about particular system approaches rather than just individual patients? But what I'd really like to get from each of you as I go around, in addition to anything else that comes up, is the one takeaway, the one thing you'd really like people in the NHS to learn. And that's whether it's people right at the top who are sort of leading things, whether it's anybody anywhere in the organisation. What's the one thing that you'd like people to take away? And I'm going to do it in traditional way, in the reverse order to the one people initially spoke on. So, Jonny, anything you want to say, but in particular your one key takeaway?
Okay, in one sentence: reinforce a just culture. It's okay for mistakes to happen. You are human.
Fantastic, thank you. Karen?
I think for me is you can't know everything, so you will make mistakes and you'll learn from those mistakes, so chill.
Okay, Chris?
I'm not going to throw anything new in, Julian. Instead, I'm going to sort of go back to Karen's point, which was the real resonation that really resonated with me, and that's the importance of honest leadership, which is about telling it like it is, and actually, even if that is about looking bad.
And finally, Gemma?
I think for me, it's that even the best decisions can still have bad outcomes. So we have to reconcile ourselves to the process of making good decisions so that we can live with the bad outcomes.
Yeah. So I found this absolutely fascinating, for the content that you've all shared from your particular experiences to what take that gives on how the NHS should be. And there's some really, really wonderful lessons there. It's been lovely to see some of the comments in the chat of where it's really been resonating. So thank you very, very much to all 4 of you, Chris, Karen, Gemma, Jonny. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I hope it will make a difference in how people think about these. It's been a huge pleasure at the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College to host this. It's one of the joys of online that we can do this and pull everybody together so much more easily. In a moment, I'm going to hand back to Fraser, but just to say we were on lots of other events from the Intellectual Forum on all sorts of subjects. Almost all of those are online, our past ones with Jimmy Chu and all sorts of other people. Peter Singer from the WHO, many, many more are there. You know, if you're free tomorrow evening, we are talking about boy actors in early modern England, just to give you a sense of the scale. And then after that, we're looking at the immigration system and how that works. And there's much, much more. So thank you very much for me. Hopefully see you in person or online in Jesus at the Intellectual Forum. And Fraser, over to you.
Thank you, Julian. Just let me just say, if you can see my screen, I've hopefully shared a final slide.
Yeah.
Is it? Great. Look, thank you to all of the panel. Thank you to Chris, to Gemma, to Jonny, and to Karen. That was an excellent session. We put it on because we thought there was something that NHS decision makers could learn from different decision making contexts, and so much of what you discussed seems to me to be immediately relevant and personally very helpful, since I'm running a leadership development program for the next couple of days, and so I can use some of the content. So thank you very much, and thank you to Julian and the Intellectual Forum for pulling it all together. Quick slide, just to show you some of the events that we've got remaining within the Insight Festival. The best place probably to look is on the website to see the detail behind each one of these. But tomorrow there's an event that might be particularly interesting to people, since David Nicholson, who's the ex-chief exec of the NHS, is talking to the editor of the HSJ about decision making. And I love the retired chief exec, because you tend to get a very honest and varnished view from them once they're no longer in the role. So maybe there'll be some more admissions of failure in that session. The only other one I wanted to draw attention to is on the 28th. There's a session on ethical decision making, and that came up in the comments, the questions, where I get to interview a philosopher, a professional ethicist. So that should also be hopefully very interesting. But that's it. Thank you ever so much for joining this session as part of the Insight Festival. Have a good evening.
Thank you.